Hello everyone, welcome to BioWorks. In my previous video, we covered pollination and its types. And today we will learn about different agents of pollination. Let's begin. So I will now explain agents of pollination. Now broadly you can see two categories under agents of pollination. One is abiotic and the other is biotic. Now we already know that abiotic are nothing but the non-living agents of pollination, whereas biotic are the living agents of pollination. Now we'll go into details of the types of abiotic and biotic agents, starting with the abiotic first. So in abiotic, if you see the first one, Anemophily. So Anemophily is a type of pollination in which the agent involved is wind. Okay, so wind is the non-living or the abiotic agent involved in pollination, and the term given to such type of pollination is Anemophily. Then the second one, if you can see this, can you guys guess what hydrophily is? Yes, you are right, because hydro means water. So hydrophily is a type of pollination where the agent is water. That's right. Let's move on to biotic agents now. So under biotic agents of pollination, you will see the first one is Entomophily. Over here, the word entomo means insect, okay, or relating to insect. So this type of pollination is carried out by insects. Okay, moving to the second one, which is Ornithophily. Over here, ornitho, the term means birds. So here, the type of pollination ornithophily is carried out by the birds. And the third one over here is Chirepterophily. Chirepterophily is a type of pollination that is carried out by the bats. Alright, so insects, birds and bats, all three are the living agents, that is the biotic agents involved in pollination. Now if you see hydrophily, which is a part of abiotic agent of pollination, is further categorized into hypohydrophily and epihydrophily. Now over here, hypo means below and epi means above, right? I'm going to write that here, below. Hypo means below and epi means above. So if you can guess, hypohydrophily, we all know already that hydro means water, right? So below water surface. Very simple to understand, below the surface of water, and over here it is above the water surface. So in short, you can say that hypohydrophily is a type of pollination which takes place below the water surface, whereas epihydrophily is a type of pollination that occurs above the surface of water. Alright, that were in short or a brief introduction to what are the different agents of pollination. We will now move into the details of each type of pollination into detail and understand that how the plants have various kind of adaptations for each type of pollination. So in this section, I'll be talking about Anemophily into more details, and I will also explain what are the adaptations of anemophilous flowers. So if you guys remember, Anemophily is a type of pollination that is carried out by wind. So let us now see the characteristics of such flowers. The first important point to remember here is that the flowers are very, very small. Yeah, so this is the first characteristic, small flowers. Right, now why do you need small flowers? Because such plants do not have to attract insects for pollination. Wind is the agent of pollination. So there is no need of big brightly colored flowers. So the first important point to note here is the flowers are small. Also they are inconspicuous, not very visible or not very prominent. Then the second point, there is no nectar. No nectar produced in the flowers. Now everyone knows what is nectar, the sweet substance that is released in the flowers for which the insects come and feed on. So there is no requirement of nectar in such flowers because there is no need of attraction of insects. Alright, then the third point, since these plants do not have to attract insects. So is there any requirement of any fragrance? No, right? So there is no fragrance also required. That was the third characteristic. Coming to the fourth one, talking about the pollen grains. Now, as we all know that this is a type of pollination carried out by wind. So the pollen grains have to be very light and they have to be dry so that they can be easily carried. So I'm going to mention that here. Light and dry pollen grains. Right? So that they will be easily carried by the wind. Okay. Then coming to the next point, talking about the stigma, right in the center, the female part of the flower. Usually if you have seen, the stigma is quite long and it is feathery. Very important to note, feathery stigma. Feathery stigma. All right. And one last point to remember is that the filaments, which is the male part of such flowers, right? You all remember filament is the part of stamen in a flower. So filaments are also long filaments. And why do you think these filaments are long? Because the wind, when it blows, it will easily carry the pollen grains from anther and it will drop it on the stigma. So that is the reason both stigma and the filaments are long enough and they are well exposed so that the wind can easily carry the pollen grains. So as an example, can you guess which plant is this? I'm sure you've guessed that right. You can post your answers in the comment section. Also give some more examples of Anemophily. Let us now understand the characteristics of hydrophilous flowers. Now, hydrophily is a type of pollination that is carried out with the help of water. Alright, so obviously in such plants we do not require insects for pollination. So again the characteristic remains common to anemophilous flowers, which is small flowers. Right? The flowers are small and inconspicuous, so because it does not have to attract any insect. So that was one important characteristic. Second important characteristic is that the floral parts, all the parts of such plants are unwettable. So I'm going to mention that point here. Unwettable floral parts. Right? Unwettable because the plants are always in water, or either they are floating on water or they are submerged. So the parts of the plant have a coating so that they do not get wet. All right. Then the third point is about the pollen grains. Pollen grains are usually long. The pollen grains are long. Also, these pollen grains are unwettable. Right? And why are the pollen grains unwettable? These pollen grains actually have a coating called as a mucilage, which makes it unwettable. Alright. Then the next important characteristic, there is no nectar produced in such flowers. Right? As we all know that there is no requirement of nectar because the plant does not have to attract any insect. So no requirement of nectar and no requirement of fragrance as well. Just a moment. Yeah, no requirement of fragrance as well. Right? So these were all the characteristics of hydrophilous flowers. And to give an example, Vallisneria is a very common example of hydrophily. So with an example, we will now understand hypohydrophily and epihydrophily. Now I have shown here two plants labeled as Zostera and Vallisneria. So you can remember Zostera is an example of hypohydrophily and Vallisneria is an example of epihydrophily. So I'll explain what is the difference between two and how pollination occurs in both of them. So starting with the first one, hypohydrophily. So you can see this is the surface of water. I have shown it over here and the plant is well below the water surface. And these are the flowers, the male flower and the female flower. So what happens in hypohydrophily is pollination occurs below the surface of water such that the pollen grains that are released from the male flowers, they come in contact with the stigma of the female flowers below the water surface. That most commonly takes place in Zostera, which is nothing but a seagrass. And what happens in epihydrophily, as we know, epi means above. So pollination occurs at the surface of water. So what happens in Vallisneria is, you can see the male flowers are under the water, whereas the female flowers are floating on the water surface. So the stalk of the flower is quite long and the female flowers are usually at the surface of water. So what happens is, pollen grains, as they are released from the flower, you can make a note over here that this is a dioecious plant. Dioecious meaning that the male and the female flowers occur on two different plants, right? So the pollen grains from the male flower are released, and with the help of water currents, they float on the water surface where they come in contact with the female flowers, right? So over there, fertilization will further take place. So actual pollination occurs on the surface of water. An important thing to note over here is the density or the specific gravity of pollen grains. Over here, the specific gravity of pollen grains in epihydrophily is same as that of water, and hence the pollen grains can float on water. But when you talk about pollen grains of Zostera, those are heavier than water, and that is why they do not float on the surface. Rather, they sink at the bottom, and then they can come in contact with the stigmas of the female flower. We will now talk about the characteristics of entomophilous flowers. We all know that entomophily is a type of pollination that is carried out by insects. And the plant that I have shown over here is salvia. I'll write down that here. Okay. Let us now understand what are the characteristics or adaptations shown by this flower. So usually the flowers are very brightly colored and they are large, right? So I'll write that down over here. Large flowers. They are conspicuous, they are large, they are beautiful, and they are very much prominent so that insects can be easily attracted to such flowers. Second important point I'll write down here, brightly colored flowers. The color is bright so that the insects are attracted. Okay. Then for attraction of insects, there is requirement of some other thing as well. Yes, that is nectar. So nectar is produced, and along with nectar, such flowers will also require production of a fragrance or a smell, right? So a sweet scent is released by such flowers. Okay. Apart from all these important characteristics, let us now talk about the stigma and the pollen grains of such flowers. The stigma, if you see, is quite sticky. Sticky stigma. Why do you think the stigma of such flower is sticky? Yes, because the pollen grains can easily stick on such stigma. Alright. And now talking about the pollen grains. The pollen grains are spiny. Pollen grains are spiny. Why do you think the pollen grains are spiny? Because when the insect comes and sits on the flower to suck the nectar, these pollen grains can attach to the body of the insect and it can drop it on the stigma. So the sticky pollen grains or the spiny pollen grains are easily attached to the body of the insect. That's how insect can help in pollination. Let us now understand ornithophily. As we know that ornithophily is a type of pollination that is carried out by birds. So we will see the adaptations of the flowers that are ornithophilous. So the first and important adaptation is that the flowers are brightly colored. So I'm going to write that down here. Brightly colored flowers. So the one that I have drawn over here is of bombax. You can see the flower of bombax is bright red in color and is quite big enough to attract the birds. Okay. The second important point is nectar is released. Okay. Such plants, they produce nectar, and the nectar that is released is profuse and dilute. So the quantity of the nectar that is produced is in excess. Okay, coming to the third point, talking about the pollen grains now. Pollen grains are usually sticky and spiny. So I'm going to write that here, sticky and spiny pollen grains. And the fourth important point, there is no fragrance or no scent that is released from the flowers. Why do you think there is no scent? Yes, that's right, because birds have poor sense of smell. So there is no requirement of scent produced by the flowers. That was about the ornithophilous flowers. So this is the last type of pollination that we are going to study in this session. So we all know that Chirepterophily is a type of pollination that is carried out by the bats. Now bats can carry pollen grains up to long distances, sometimes up to several kilometers. So let us see what are the adaptations of Chirepterophilous flowers. So the first important adaptation is that the flowers are dull. Flowers are dull. Okay, then the second point is the nectar that is produced. Of course, these flowers produce nectar and the nectar is abundant. So the quantity of the nectar produced is in excess. And the last point, which is important, the amount of pollen grains. Large amount of pollen grains produced. Now, why do you think large amount of pollen grains are produced? Because when the bats have to carry these pollen grains from one site to another, there may be some wastage of pollen grains in between, right? So that is why the plant generally produces large amount of pollen grains to compensate for the loss. So that was all about the types or the agents which help in pollination. So hope the video was useful to you all. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And you can also write to me on my email ID, which is provided in the description. And you can also visit my website bioworks.in. Thank you.